and he had to make the terrifying decision to take one more good breath and then ditch your air tanks. Indian Springs is a very popular underwater diving location in Florida. Deep below the surface, there are hundreds and hundreds of miles of tunnels that are both explored and unexplored. In November of 1991, a specially trained, specially qualified group of elite divers went to Indian Springs to conduct a research dive down at the 300-foot mark. There was a number of divers that were going to be a part of this dive, but the only two that were going to be passing through something called squaw's restriction were Parker Turner and Bill Gavin. If you think of Indian Springs like an hourglass, you have a big open space up top, you get a big open space down below, and squaw's restriction is that tiny little space in the center of the hourglass. Before they began this dive, they threw a line down through squaw's restriction all the way down to the 300-foot mark that had an anchor at the end of it, and this would serve as their guideline so that when they were going down deep, if silt kicked up or visibility was obstructed for any reason, they always had a way to reference where they needed to go. On the morning of November 17th, Bill and Parker put on their dive gear, they fired up their underwater scooters they were using, and they began their descent. And they explored for about 25 minutes before looking at their watches and saying, yep, we gotta go back up. So with one hand on their scooters and one hand on the guideline, they begin making their ascent. And they keep on going up, up, up until their hands stop because the guideline is now leading them into sand and rock and mud, as if the guideline is going into the wall. And that's when they stopped and looked at each other and they realized squaw's restriction has caved in. We're trapped. Each of the men had a slate where they could use a grease pen to write a message and hold it up and show their dive partner, and that was how they communicated. And at this point, Parker wrote, "What are we going to do now?" And Bill wrote back, "Let's look around." They start trying to clear the debris away, but they're finding it almost impossible because as soon as they move something out of the way, whatever is on top just pushes down into it and fills it back in. After a couple of minutes of doing that and all the silt is in their faces, they couldn't even hold their slates up to talk to each other because the visibility was so bad. So they both went lower in the water column to where there was no silt around them, and they both looked at each other, and that's when Parker held up his air gauge and showed Bill, "I only have about 10 minutes of air left." And that's when Bill looked at his air gauge and he realized he too only had about 10 minutes of air left. And Bill, not knowing what else to say, just wrote, "Hold on, I'll take a look." And so Bill leaves the guideline and swims over to another section away from squaw's restriction in hopes he might find some other exit out of the space they're in, even though he knew full well there wasn't anything besides squaw's restriction. And after a couple of minutes of looking around and not finding an additional exit, he goes back over to where Parker had been when he had left him, except Parker's not here anymore. And Bill suddenly thinks maybe he's found a way to get through this. And so Bill, with almost no air left, grabs the guideline and swims up into the silty cloud and gets to the cave-in to discover it's still caved in. However, he sees the base of Parker's tanks wedged in the obstruction itself. And he's looking at the tanks thinking, how did Parker get in that position? And then he realizes that's just his tanks. Parker is not attached to them anymore. And that's when Bill realizes what Parker probably had done. Parker had tried to force himself through the obstruction and probably got about halfway before becoming completely wedged and stuck himself. And he had to make the terrifying decision to take one more good breath and then ditch your air tanks and try to swim on a breath hold to the set of spare tanks they had set up about 100 meters away above squaw's restriction. But at this point, regardless what's happened with Parker, his tanks were positioned in a way that it had created a little bit of an opening in the obstruction that Bill was able to swim through with his tanks on. And so once he got through, he realized he had about 30 seconds of air. Bill swims as fast as he can. He actually literally runs out of air and is on a breath hold himself by the time he reaches these tanks. He takes a huge gulp of air, and after he calmed down, he took his light out and he scanned around and he found Parker, and he was floating, deceased clearly, about 30 meters away. He had made it pretty far on a breath hold, but had just gone slightly off, and he didn't have any of his equipment. It was all attached to his tanks. And so in total darkness, he was just blindly swimming and did not locate the air tanks.